If you love chilling mysteries, unsolved cases, and a touch of mom-style humor, Moms and Mysteries is the podcast you've been searching for. Hey guys, I'm Mandy.
And I'm Melissa. Join us every Tuesday for Moms and Mysteries, your gateway to gripping, well-researched true crime stories. Each week, we deep dive into a variety of mind-boggling cases as we shed light on everything from heists to whodunits. We're your go-to podcast for mysteries with a motherly touch. Subscribe now to Moms and Mysteries wherever you get your podcasts.
Good evening, everyone. Laszlo Montgomery with you again. Thanks for tuning in to the China History Podcast. I have another good one today from our modern age. And like a lot of CHP episodes featured here, this is a topic that's been suggested more than a few times. And I was thinking, after I saw Oppenheimer and recalling all the hysteria he got caught up in during the 1950s following the communist victory in the Chinese Civil War, I couldn't help but think back to the whole McCarthy-era dogpile on Qian Xuesen and how we ended up scoring one of the most consequential own goals in all of modern American history. And at least since I've been around, we've scored more than our share. As an American, this is one of those painful stories to recollect. However, for any PRC national, this story is a chance to sit back, point a finger at Uncle Sam, and enjoy a nice laugh on us. Anyway, here's Qian Xuesen's story. He lived a very long life, almost to 100, so there's a lot that happened. I'm mostly going to focus on the USA part of his life. And rather than have you wait 2 weeks in between part 1 and part 2, I'm going to be releasing them as 2 slightly shorter than usual episodes simultaneously. You know, sort of like what Springsteen did in 1992 with Lucky Town and Human Touch. And this being a presentation of the life of Qian Xuesen, a rather large and significant part of the story is, it's hard to tell without delving into the complex mathematics, physics, and all the equations and theories. We lay people can only look on and wonder at these trailblazers in science and engineering and only marvel at their genius, but cannot even begin to understand it. He was born in the Shanghai International Settlement in December 1911, 62 days after the Wuchang Uprising. His birthplace was Shanghai, but his Jiguan, his hometown, was Hangzhou. Hangzhou was the birthplace of Qian Xuesen's illustrious ancestor, Qian Liu. Qian Liu is a hometown hero in the city of Hangzhou, where he was born and where he put his capital after he founded the Wuyue Kingdom, reigning from 907 to 932. As you recall, following the fall of the Tang Dynasty, there was the 72-year period of the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms. Qian Liu was called the Dragon King, or the Sea Dragon King, because of his extensive hydroengineering schemes, which tamed the waters and built all the famous canals that are found in this well-watered part of China where the Wu dialect is prevalent. And from that time in the 10th century, all the way into our present day, the Qian surname remains widespread throughout the region, and especially in Hangzhou, and this is where Qian Xuesen's people came from. His childhood, under the tutelage of his father, an educator from an aristocratic background, was filled with many extracurricular activities that would enhance his education. And from his first day of classes until the end, he was not only a serious student, he excelled in a student body made up of rather rich, or at the very least, privileged children in the nation's capital who had the grades to get into the best of the best schools in all of China. As the new Republic of China lurched forward, at the age of 3, Qian's father obtained a post with the new Ministry of Education. This was in 1914. So the family left Hangzhou and moved up to Beijing, where young Qian Xuesen had access to the best schools and teachers. He attended Beijing No. 2, one of the first public elementary schools in China. And by age 5, he had already shown both a passion and an aptitude for science and math. And over the next several years, he began his education in all the foundational aspects of chemistry, physics, and math. In 1923, age 12, he enrolled at a high school affiliated with Peking Normal University, one of the most prestigious in the city. And in 1929, he graduated from high school and was admitted into the Department of Mechanical Engineering at National Jiaotong University. His genius and extraordinary mind and wide spectrum of interest was evident by now. One of his teachers, who left quite an impression on him, was Qian Xuesen, a renowned professor of thermodynamics and a leading light in the field of mechanical engineering. His academic career took a bad hit in the late summer of 1930 when, age 20, he contracted typhus. Back then, the disease was a lot more virulent. Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin in 1928, but large-scale production of penicillin wouldn't begin until right after the end of World War II. And by the fall of 1931, he was able to return to the campus and resume his studies. I haven't mentioned anything, but you all know what's been playing out in the background. From the moment Qian Xuesen was born in 1911, the Chinese nation and people were facing one of the roughest periods in the nation's recent history. The cement of the fragile constitutional government was never allowed to set. Warlords were in control of every corner of the country, and the contention between the CCP and KMT had been going on since the founding of the Communist Party in July 1921. It was a very volatile and dangerous time to be a public intellectual, no matter which side you spoke out for or against. And after Zhou Yiba, 9/18/1931, a whole new layer of discourse was being fiercely debated on the university campuses. Resistance against Japanese aggression, after percolating beneath the surface for a while, finally started manifesting itself in public demonstrations. And these protests were directed not only against the Japanese presence in China, but also against the toothless and corrupt KMT regime who appeared to be doing little to counter the Japanese. And this was the state of the campus of Jiaotong University when Qian Xuesen returned to classes in the fall of 1931. He had spent his period of convalescence carrying out self-study in a wide number of subjects other than science and engineering. He played the violin and loved classical music, a passion that stayed with him till the end of his days. In 1934, Qian received his undergrad degree in mechanical engineering. And this goes without saying, he was either the top student in his graduation class or among the top. You remember following the Boxer Rebellion, the foreign powers forced an agreement on the Manchu Qing government. 450 million taels of silver China had to cough up. They had 39 years to pay it off at 4% interest, and almost half of that sum went to Russia and Germany alone. The USA was to receive 7.32% of the indemnity. And a little later, in 1908, the U.S. Congress, despite fierce opposition, passed a bill that called for a portion of these indemnity funds to be used to establish the Boxer Indemnity Scholarship Program. Theodore Roosevelt was the champion of this idea that he hoped would offer up a chance for American-directed reform in China that might improve U.S.-China relations and serve as a bridge between Chinese and American culture. It was also believed by many in American politics and society that this gesture might offset all the negatives, such as Chinese exclusion laws and the well-earned reputation for the racism that was all pervasive in American society at that time. The president of my alma mater, the University of Illinois, was Edmund James. He was the one who put the bug in Roosevelt's ear when he wrote, quote, "China is upon the verge of revolution. The nation which succeeds in educating the young Chinese of the present generation will be the nation for which a given expenditure of effort will reap the largest possible returns in moral, intellectual, and commercial influence." End quote. Still rings true today, many will argue. In 1911, funds from the program were used to establish Tsinghua College, which soon after became Tsinghua University. And among the student beneficiaries of this prestigious Boxer Indemnity Scholarship was Qian Xuesen. And the following year, in August 1935, age 24, Qian left Tsinghua for a chance to study aeronautics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He began studying at MIT in September 1935. Because they didn't yet have a serious aeronautics department, his stay there wasn't very long, lasting not quite 1 year. Qian received his master's degree in December 1936, and then he headed westward to the Golden State. This was really the perfect time to study aeronautics. Serious interest in rocketry began to emerge at the California Institute of Technology, or Caltech. This came as a consequence of the earliest experiments being carried out in Germany at the time. After the Nazi Party came to power in 1933, the priority for research in rockets got front-burnered in Germany, and a 21-year-old genius by the name of Wernher von Braun joined the team that would go on to almost single-handedly create this new technology. So I've given you a very cursory overview of his early education. As you could see, Qian Xuesen wasn't lacking for teachers and top-notch schools up to now. Where the Earth's atmosphere ends and outer space begins is an imaginary line, about 100 or so kilometers or 330,000 feet above mean sea level. This line is called the von Karman line. It's named after a man, a Hungarian-American mathematician, aerospace engineer, and physicist named Theodore von Karman, better known outside Magyarország, or Hungary, as Theodore von Karman. As I did with young Qian Xuesen, I'll spare you the details about how brilliant von Karman was as a young child. In 1926, von Karman was invited to the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena to help them build a wind tunnel that would help in studying objects and the air moving around them. Wind tunnels were essential to test the aerodynamic effects of wind on aircraft, rockets, cars, and buildings, too. 4 years later, von Karman was made the director of a new aeronautical laboratory at Caltech funded by the Guggenheims. They were able to twist von Karman's arm and get him to accept the directorship of the Guggenheim Aeronautical Laboratory at the California Institute of Technology. And that's where it all began for the United States. Research on rockets began there in earnest in 1936. And thanks in large part to the research and discoveries made there, only 33 years later, the Apollo 11 astronauts would land on the moon. The Guggenheim Aeronautical Laboratory at the California Institute of Technology is a bit less famous than the institution it spawned, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, or JPL. Qian arrived in sunny Southern California, where he studied under von Karman. Another key figure at the time was one of von Karman's doctoral students, Frank Malina. Qian became very close to Malina, and the two of them, along with a few other doctoral students and engineers, formed a small group at Caltech, immortalized as the Suicide Squad. Because of the extreme hazards, back then at least, in experimenting with rockets, they earned this moniker. Von Karman served as the advisor to this team of a half-dozen young, inquisitive, and daring scientists with complementary skills ranging from mathematics to mechanical engineering. The initial research and experimentation was in building sounding rockets that could soar as high as the upper atmosphere and provide scientists and meteorologists with all kinds of data. And their early experiments carried out in the Arroyo Seco aimed to turn theory into practice. Arroyo Seco, it's a dry riverbed that runs past the current location of JPL, a few miles north of the Rose Bowl in Pasadena. That's where all the earliest experimentation was carried out. Everything was self-funded. No government support this early in the game. Rocketry in the 1930s was still science fiction, the stuff of Fritz Lang's silent films. Qian Xuesen joined the Suicide Squad as their resident mathematician and quickly began making contributions that raised the bar of the level of scientific understanding about the rocket motors they were trying to build. Under von Karman, Qian studied aeronautical engineering theory and applied mechanics, and he obtained his Ph.D. in math and aeronautics in June of 1939. Von Karman also ran a kind of salon out of his home in Pasadena where all his students and colleagues could chit-chat about their musings regarding aeronautical engineering, rockets, aerodynamics, chemistry, theoretical physics, and mathematics. Qian shared an office with Frank Malina, and the two became very close. But in 1938, they did something that would come back to haunt them many years later. Both of them had attended a social gathering that the FBI suspected was a meeting of the Pasadena Communist Party. Communism in the 1930s was already a filthy word in America thanks to the Bolsheviks. The so-called First Red Scare that followed the Russian Revolution of 1917 led to the arrest of a lot of American labor rights activists and radicals, but that was all kid stuff compared to the Second Red Scare of the 1950s. That's the one we'll talk about later. But in the 1930s, with the Great Depression affecting everyone and the Second World War still far in the future, a lot of intellectuals and working people, to varying degrees, went and kicked the tires of communism. That word was still a dog whistle back then, but the sound was closer to 23 kilohertz than the 54 kilohertz of the 1950s. Yeah, like a lot of people did, Qian and Malina and other scientists attended meetings in people's living rooms or at town halls and were schooled on the merits of this ideology. If you remember from the film, Robert Oppenheimer's brother Frank was a regular attendee at these get-togethers. Not everyone signed up, but plenty of people were curious to learn more. No one knew back then what we know today. Although Qian vehemently denied being a member of the Communist Party, it's believed he and Frank Malina joined up in 1938. Malina was quite enthusiastic and fully embraced socialism as an antidote for the ills of capitalism. Anyway, that has nothing to do with our story for the next 15 years. So right here, in the mid-1930s, the U.S. was on the cusp of launching an aeronautics industry, and Qian was at the center of it all, armed only with a pen, paper, a slide rule, and a most brilliant mind. In June 1938, the now 27-year-old Qian Xuesen completed his doctoral dissertation entitled Problems in Motion of Compressible Fluids and Reaction Propulsion. Also around that time, the U.S. Army Air Corps leader and aviation pioneer, General Hap Arnold, got wind about the exploits of the Suicide Squad and came calling on them. General Arnold tasked the squad to develop jet-assisted takeoff technology for heavy bombers, providing additional thrust from small rockets. Frank Malina wasn't so keen on the idea of rocket technology being used in military applications. To him, and all the scientists working at Caltech on these aeronautical engineering projects, this was a matter of science, of designing rockets that could be used to help humankind, not deliver bombs and destruction. Nonetheless, up to that time, in early 1939, the Suicide Squad team and anyone else working on this new technology had to spend a lot of their time diving for dimes, always working overtime to fund their research. But once their rich Uncle Sam came along, the sky was the limit as far as their further experimentation went. Up to the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, Qian's immigration status and not being a U.S. citizen had led to some complications regarding his access to certain information. But after Pearl Harbor, all that changed. A rocket scientist and engineer, the likes of Qian Xuesen, being critical and all, rules were allowed to be rewritten. All along, von Karman had written on Qian's behalf and vouched for his trustworthiness. Qian's handlers in China, associated with the Boxer Indemnity Scholarships and the nationalist military, were calling on him to return to China. Patriotism-wise, that would have been the right thing to do. But as a scientist, this would have been a great leap backward to go from MIT and Caltech to what Chinese universities and research institutes had at that time. So he stayed in America. After several years as a research assistant at Caltech, Qian, in the fall of 1943, became an assistant professor of aeronautics. He was quite a terror as a professor and famously suffered no fools, preferring to expend his teaching efforts on students who were closer to him on the genius spectrum. General Hap Arnold recruited Qian to work as a scientific consultant to the Army Air Corps Scientific Advisory Group, and now, with his security clearance in hand, Qian was given an Air Force officer commission. And by the summer of 1943, aerial reconnaissance showed evidence that the Germans were very, very close to full-scale production of rockets and missiles. This late in the war, with Hitler now on the run, if the Nazis were able to make use of these missiles like they intended to, it could have represented a formidable strategic advancement. So right here in November 1943, that's when von Karman, Malina, and Qian suggested to representatives of the embryonic American military-industrial complex that if they were serious about building long-range rockets, they should pony up some funding and combine government support of their research and development. And from this appeal, to bring together the power of the USG and the great minds at the California Institute of Technology to jointly design, test, and build rocket engines, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory was born. Not many people know that the father of China's space program was one of the co-founders of JPL. Anyway, all the earliest research that went on after the creation of JPL, it didn't matter to the war effort. Before they were delivering tangible results that had been thoroughly tested, the 2 atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were already in history's rearview mirror. But the generals all knew there'd be plenty of other chances in the decades to come to use these cutting-edge weapons. After the war, at von Karman's request, Qian went to Washington, D.C. as part of the team that helped draft the report Towards New Horizons, which served as a blueprint for the development of the United States Air Force. He traveled to government-funded labs across the country, making recommendations and talking with other scientists. He also spent a lot of time at the recently built Pentagon, meeting with Defense Department officials. By the end of the war, he was one of the world's foremost experts on jet propulsion, and just as Germany was going down in defeat, Qian, holding the temporary rank of lieutenant colonel, accompanied Theodore von Karman on an extraordinary mission to Germany. In April 1945, Qian flew to Europe, and he was part of the team who debriefed the great Wernher von Braun and the other top German scientists and engineers. All of that research and hard work expended by Germany's greatest minds was of immense help to the Americans. It was downright shocking to the American scientists how far along the Germans were in almost everything. Qian also got to take in a concentration camp when he was in Germany near Nordhausen. Camp survivors there told Qian and his group of an entire rocket manufacturing and assembly complex built underneath a mountain where they were producing V-2 rockets, the very same ones that struck London the previous year of 1944. June 20th, 1945, Qian returned to Washington, D.C., and over the next few years he published a number of papers and was generally acknowledged that, next to Theodore von Karman, Qian Xuesen was the most brilliant aeronautical scientist in the country, and by extension, perhaps the whole world. The U.S. military loved him. He produced one groundbreaking report after another on theoretical aerodynamics and jet propulsion. MIT tried to lure him back with an associate professorship and tenure. So, in August 1946, Qian resigned from Caltech and headed back to Massachusetts the following month. As a professor, he was just as much a terror there as he had been at Caltech. Students were awed by his obvious virtuosities, but his style was very brusque, and classes were sessions where Qian would spend the whole time writing equations on the chalkboard. And if you couldn't keep up, that was your problem, and he didn't like students asking questions. The following year, 1947, age 36, Qian was made a full professor. He also applied for permanent residency in the U.S., a necessity for anyone aiming to one day become a citizen. Also in July, he flew back to China, now in the middle of a bloody civil war. It had been 12 years since he began this odyssey that had led him to such lofty heights in the U.S. military and academia. His contributions, along with his colleagues, had served like rocket boosters themselves, leading to advances in aeronautics that no one even dreamed of. After a few weeks speaking at universities in Shanghai, Hangzhou, and Beijing, he returned to the U.S. During this trip where he witnessed his homeland and one of its historic low points, he reconnected with an old childhood friend, Jiang Ying. The two began their courtship. She came from an even more aristocratic and well-to-do family than Qian. Her father was a major guy in the KMT, as well as a respected intellectual. And she attended school in Europe for 11 years, returning to China in 1946. Her passion, as it was with Qian Xuesen, was music, and she had studied music and voice in Europe and became quite a sensation after her singing performances wowed the audiences back in Shanghai. They were married in Shanghai on September 17, 1947. Qian returned to the States a week later, and his bride followed not long afterwards. Once safely ensconced back in Boston, Qian returned to his life of teaching, research, and advising the U.S. military on matters regarding rockets, missiles, and supersonic flight. The Qians were blessed with their first child, a son, in October 1948, and a baby daughter would follow in 1950. And Qian Xuesen was also honored with a new position given to him by the Daniel and Florence Guggenheim Foundation, as they had been doing all along, going back to the time of Robert Goddard's experiments in Roswell, Mexico in the 1930s. The Guggenheims created 2 new jet propulsion research labs at Caltech and Princeton, and they offered the directorship of both labs to Qian Xuesen. So after careful consideration, once again, Qian bid farewell to MIT, and in the summer of 1949, he and his family returned to the lovely town of Pasadena. Had dinner there last night with my kids. Well, as we all know, October 1949, what was already a foregone conclusion, did eventually come to pass. The Communists won the Civil War, and the KMT regime sought refuge in Taiwan. Still there, by the way. And the Qians had to decide where their loyalties now lie. And Qian Xuesen, he chose the U.S. of A. and, already a permanent resident, applied for citizenship. Let me quote from Iris Zhang from her 1995 book, Thread of the Silkworm. Quote, "He had everything, it seemed, that a man could want. A lovely wife, a son, a fabulous career, and lifetime security. The little Chinese student who arrived 15 years earlier was now the living embodiment of the American dream." End quote. Qian kept up an awesome pace, teaching, engaging in research, writing more groundbreaking papers, helping to develop solid rocket fuel boosters, consulting to JPL and the Aerojet Corporation, and working on projects for the various branches of the U.S. military that his security clearance allowed him to do. And for those of us who aren't chest-deep in academia or research in science and technology and aeronautics, it's hard to fully appreciate or quantify the advances he was making both on his own and in consort with other scientists and engineers he worked with. Not quite 40 years old, he had become a giant in his field. Sure, he had his eccentricities and quirks, but from the Pentagon to the classrooms at MIT and Caltech, he was someone who awed people with the extent of his capabilities. He was a living legend, and despite his diminutive size, when he walked into a room, people noticed. But as Geoffrey Chaucer wrote back in the 1300s, all good things must come to an end. And come 1950, that's what happened. And I'm going to end part 1 right here, but rest assured you could go right on ahead and listen to part 2 as well, coming right up. So, this is Laszlo Montgomery signing off from Los Angeles, California. I thank you for listening, and I cordially invite you to listen to part 2. Thanks again, everyone.